that Volodymyr Zelensky is travelling to the UN in New York and then to Washington to present what he calls a victory plan. What do we know about what his victory plan, and what's his purpose? Is his purpose to get cooperation for what he believes will bring about victory, or is it to force Putin and the Russians into negotiations, or what?
It is interesting watching people interpret this, both Ukrainian commentators and in the West. I think it's meant to do many different things. There's an element of keep the faith.
Yep.
Because after all, he knows that Joe Biden has been dragging his heels on authorising use of UK-supplied Storm Shadows, things like that. So it's keep the faith. We can still bring about the result that we want, but I think there's also going to be at the private level, the level we don't hear about, some discussion about, well, what if we do have to stop in the coming months?
Yeah.
It is clear, and President Zelensky has always said this since the outset, that bringing this successfully to a halt requires Western security guarantees. That doesn't necessarily mean joining NATO, but it does mean that a group of Western countries, principally the United States, would make pledges and would also, let's say it's a ceasefire for a time-limited period. The key from the Ukrainian point of view is not to let Russia just come back strengthened, having sort of healed its wounds and built up,
dug trenches across the Donbass or whatever.
Yeah, and basically recruited and trained new people, made more weapons. Yeah. So the key thing is that if and I don't think Ukraine wants to get into this situation, but if a combination of harm to their infrastructure, difficulty raising enough soldiers, all of these things which we know they suffer, plus some desire on the part of the US to bring about some sort of diplomatic development in the final days of the Biden administration, causes a halt to fighting, that they're able to make better use of that than the Russians. In other words, ramp up defense production in Ukraine, lots of military technology, train their own people, and get guarantees from the West.
And how much of what worries him is the looming possibility of President Donald Trump Mark II?
Well, it's got to. And frankly, if you look, there's $6 billion left in the kitty for military aid to Ukraine. You may remember around this time last year, a big conflict started between Republicans in the House of Representatives and the administration. And from October last year, for several months, they blocked a big package of military aid. It was about $50 billion worth. Now, that money has almost all been used now. There's $6 billion left. So the question is, even if it's Kamala Harris administration and during those final months of the Biden administration, but it's a Republican-controlled Congress, there could still be a big problem in getting additional military help to Ukraine. So Zelensky has to think about all of these variables. And, of course, he's aiming to meet Trump as well during this visit in the hope that somehow he can persuade him to keep going.
When Trump says, when I'm president, this conflict will be over in 24 hours, what does he mean by that, do you think? Does he mean this conflict will be over in 24 hours because I'll turn off the money tap and Ukraine will have to surrender territory? Or do you think is that like trying to... Is this like trying to understand why a dog does a funny dance? I mean, how much sense can we make of this?
Yeah, I think it's probably one of those ones not to read too literally. Funnily enough, he said something similar about the Gaza war, that he would get on to Netanyahu and tell him to knock it off. So, I mean, look, he obviously wants to pose as the guy. One of the big claims of his campaign is that, when he was president, there were no conflicts, or and of course American troops who were serving in Syria and Iraq or whatever say what. But in general, it's true. There was a relatively low level of conflict.
He didn't start any fresh wars.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
And they argue, when he killed Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Republican Guard covert arm, the Quds Force, and everyone thought, oh my Lord, what's he going to start here? They would argue that they successfully intimidated and deterred Iran from doing all sorts of stuff. So, look, he's trying to say, the war's gone on long enough, I can resolve it, but as we know, not so easy in practice.
Might be harder than that. Before I let you go, Mark, what else should we be looking at around the world this week?
Honestly, I think we've covered it because there'll be so much going on in New York this week. There is a thing called the General Assembly where ambassadors sit most weeks, and then there is the General Assembly where all the world leaders come in. The president of Iran will be there. All sorts of people will go in there. Curiously, it normally coincides with Fashion Week in New York, so you get this odd combination of motorcades and top models.
Yeah.
It's a curious atmosphere, but what it means is that there's a possibility for all kinds of side meetings, so-called bilaterals. And it is a chance for Keir Starmer to talk to various people if he's there. It's a chance for Zelensky to talk to all kinds of people in terms of trying to keep the West, signed up still to supporting Ukraine. But I think there's also be scope for, like the Qataris who've been at the centre of so much diplomacy recently with Gaza, but also a little bit also with Ukraine and Russia. That's the thing to watch.
There's not going to be a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, is there?
I guess there might be.
Right.
One of the interesting things about the ceasefire call here is in a context of the fighting with Hezbollah in Lebanon, a ceasefire works to Israel's interest.
Yep.
Because they want to stop
the bombs raining down on northern Israel.
Get the population back to the north of the country, and equally allow 150,000 Lebanese who've left the south of Lebanon. But the Israelis wanted to stop. Whereas when we were hearing a few months ago people like Benjamin Netanyahu batting back calls for ceasefire in Gaza, that's because they felt the job was unfinished. Now, it's largely unfinished because their war aims are so poorly defined and hard to reach. But leave that to one side. With Hezbollah, it is interesting to see the dynamics of this because it's Hezbollah that doesn't want to stop because they're saying they're doing what they're doing in effect in solidarity with Hamas and Gaza, and therefore they don't want to stop. The Israelis want them to stop. And I think looking at Iran behind all of this, they will be saying to Hezbollah, well, yes, I'm sure the British and the Americans and the French would call on you to cease fire, but we don't want you to.
Isn't that really why? Is it really in solidarity with Gaza, or is it part of a sort of bigger Iranian-backed plan to, destabilise Israel, worry Israel, harass Israel?
It's all of those things. Hezbollah's fight with Israel exists on multiple levels. There's a little local territorial dispute which provides a bit of tactical interest from time to time when they feel they need to ratchet things up. Of course, there's the overarching ideological struggle. They don't accept the right of Israel to exist. So Hezbollah can find reasons to engage Israel militarily when it wants to. But clearly, their issue at the moment is if they stop, they will be perceived to have shown weakness and perceived to have been overmatched by the Israelis, and that's the dilemma there.
You suggest in your column this weekend that one of the reasons behind Hezbollah's vast arsenal of rockets is in order to defend Iran should Israel turn its sights on the Iranian nuclear program, which suggests that they don't want to get drawn into a bigger war because then they'd be using the rockets that they need to keep.
That's absolutely right. The facts behind this balance of power or deterrence in the Middle East for the past decade have been that Iran has armed Hezbollah with all kinds of long-range precision strike weapons. So these are quite different to the kind of rockets that, for example, Hamas was firing from Gaza. Hezbollah, if it wants to, can hit particular buildings. Let's say they want to shut down Tel Aviv airport. They've often talked about doing that, and they have the capability to do it. They have missiles and drones with hundreds of kilometers of range and precision guidance. So they're very, very different from Hamas. Now, the presumption has been in the region for the past decade or so that the reason they have all that is to deter Israel from hitting Iran's nuclear program. So in a sense, they are Iran's ultimate deterrent. If you bomb Iran, then all kinds of bad things will happen, all kinds of damage to Israeli power stations, airports, chemicals, all these things will happen. And that's been the presumption. Now, the Israelis are ratcheting things right up, and effectively, Hezbollah will soon face a choice. It'll be use it or lose it. Do we use these long-range weapons before we use them? Or, and I think this is the Israeli gamble or calculation, does Iran start to say to Hezbollah, hang on a minute, we don't particularly want you to get drawn in, to a fight with all our long-range deterrent at this particular moment, because if you expend that and do some damage to Israel, they could then feel much more free to attack our nuclear facilities.
Wow. What's the fallout been from the fascinating pager attack last week? Because one hears a lot of division over whether this was a very irresponsible, untargeted attack, or in fact a very clean attack. What's the sort of the response to that, both in Israel and in Lebanon?
Well, I mean, obviously in Lebanon, the emphasis has been on, a child standing next to her dad who got killed, people being collateral damage in this. I mean, it was interesting when it happened. There was a sort of gee whiz from loads of old spooks and Middle East hands across social media and in the mainstream media, effectively just extolling this as, a sort of definitive Trojan horse operation for the technological age, all this sort of hyperbole. I think it has had quite a big effect, because it wounded, the first phase of it, the pager phase, wounded at least 3,000 people. And I think it is almost certainly true that the great majority of those were active members of Hezbollah. Now, you can have the debate about, but was this guy involved in one of their clinics or, social programs?
Yeah,
but
sure.
The Israelis say, no. We knew when they were bought that these pagers were for the military command structure. So in that sense, it is a relatively discriminating form of attack.
Yeah, sure. Before we move on from this particular part of the world, the Israeli president was saying over the weekend that Hezbollah was in the final stages, was about to launch a ground assault into Israel. That seems to sort of go against what everybody else is saying.
I think what the Israelis have been worrying about since the 7th of October last year is it's not so much that Hezbollah is going to try and march on Jerusalem, which they do talk about in some of their propaganda and stuff like that, but it's that a significant attack is made, for example, for the purpose of taking a few Israeli soldiers hostage. This is what happened in 2006 and sparked a conflict at that point. It's more that sort of thing, that with forces arrayed along the border precisely to stop them doing that, they spot a weak point, and maybe a few hundred Hezbollah people attack, they cause some casualties, they take a couple of hostages. That's the sort of scale or level of event, I think, that Israelis are concerned about.
Sure.